Hello, friends. David Vos here again. I know it's been a couple of days since we did the last video, and I know it's important for a lot of you to hear this series and get on with it because there's so many questions I can imagine going through your mind, and I'd like to answer all of the questions in a 5-minute period or in one video, but there's just so much we need to cover because I can't just say, oh, this is the way it was, because you'd think I was crazy. So we have to establish evidence. Now, I went to go see my daughter, and so I was gone a couple of days, and I'm heading back now, and I stopped along the road here at this beautiful lake, and I'm going to finish this next in the series. And I was just thinking as I turned this camera, I thought, well, what we need to do and what we need to discuss today to kind of shore up all of this information, so that we get a good idea of what we're talking about. Because we've made some big claims, and we've got to be able to support those claims and show how this is really truth. We can't just be, making up stuff, right? And I know a lot of you probably think, well, where do you get that information? Well, this is information that is in the world, but you just got to look for it. Because there's so many things. It's like glitter that's in your way, because you're going to look in a book and it's going to say Jerusalem is in Israel, or they're going to say the 12 tribes were in Palestine and they've always been there, and of course they're going to say that's what everybody's been thinking. What they don't tell you is we don't really have any evidence for that. Like I said, they've never discovered Solomon's temple. Well, what's that big wailing wall they got down there, Dave? Well, that's Herod's temple. So we don't have Solomon's temple, which was like, imagine one of the 7 wonders of the world. This was a big deal. See, we're reading the Bible, and we're reading about the father of all nations who made a monument, and we're thinking, oh, well, he set up a rock, and put some oil on it, and it was a big deal, but nobody else in the entire world knew anything about it. But thank God they wrote it down in the Bible, because we got a record of it. But otherwise, we'd have no archaeological way of knowing, because it was just a rock that he rolled over from maybe the size, maybe he could lift it, so it wasn't very big, right? He didn't have a crane, right? He didn't have armies. It wasn't like the Egyptians, who made these huge pyramids with, who knows, God knows how they made them, with thousands of tons of rock. But oh no, this is just some Babylonian out there with his turban, and his camel, and he rolls a rock over, maybe 12 of them, puts them in a little circle and goes, little abracadabra Shazam, and there's the most important thing in history, right? And he buries his son there, and Isaac and Jacob, and, and their wives, and Sarai, and all of these individuals, most important man of history, and it's a rock that somehow got moved, right? We don't even know where the rock was. We don't know where the spot was, the most precious place in all of history. We don't know where any of this stuff is. We don't know. You say, well, Dave, they've done a lot of archaeology, and they found if they haven't found Solomon's temple, then haven't they found something like the land of Canaan, right? That's where they went. Haven't they found archaeological evidence for that? Well, they found the word Canaan in Egyptian writings and Babylonian writings, but it doesn't pinpoint where. It doesn't say, oh, it's right over there off the coast of Gaza, right, in Palestine. That's a word we have today. First of all, these words are all written in Babylonian, if you're going to read a Babylonian tablet. And it's like, it doesn't even have the same spelling. They're like, oh, that's probably the same, place, And, oh, well, yeah, it's over there it says right there, it's in Israel. Okay, so we know where Israel is, right? No, we know where Israel is today. But here's what I mean. In the Babylonian texts that they've dug up, recently and over the last few years, they found this. You probably heard about the Battle of Carchemish. This is supposedly where Babylon went down into Egypt and had this great war with the Egyptians. And after they won the Egyptians, then they just trotted up a couple of 300 miles up to Jerusalem and took that too. And took all the people of Judah into captivity to Babylon. Now, wait a minute. So, it mentions that the Jews were taken captive in the Babylonian records. And it says it in the Bible. So it's got to be true. Well, it is true. Except the story, according to the Babylonians, it was a war against Egypt. So those Jews that was taken captive to Babylon weren't taken from Palestine. They were taken from Egypt. It was the Battle of Carchemish. This is in Egypt. It's not in Palestine. We don't have a big rock with, all this written in Aramaic. And it's okay, this is the place, Dave. For future generations, let them know this was the Battle of Carchemish. No, the Battle of Carchemish was down in Egypt. We know that. And when they finished up wiping, think about the absurdity of what people think, just to try and distort this reality that we live in. They say, well, this amazing battle between two of the world powers, Egypt and Babylon. Egypt was losing power and wasn't going to be the world power anymore. So Babylon comes in. Remember, Egypt was a world power before Babylon. So Babylon takes the scene and has this great big battle. Oh, but those Israelites up there in Palestine, they were just kind of little. They weren't, they weren't part of the battle. They just got sucked up in the whole thing, and they took all the king's men, all the men of Judah, the line of David. They took them all to Babylon. What are they worried about the line of David for? But they don't have a war. It's not this big battle with it. I mean, if the great line of kings that they took to Babylon was so important, wouldn't you think that they would be the actual kings of the world? Not just some like Babylonian king line up here that nobody cares about, that just happened to take them with them, and that happens to be, 2,000 years later, like that was the most important part of the story, is they took the line of David, Jehoiakim, and Zedekiah, the kings of Israel. Okay. Israel. Oh, okay, that sounds Egyptian. Well, never mind that. They had a big war with Egypt, and then when they were finished, they didn't take any Egyptians, right? They didn't take them over. They didn't take their people as slaves. Oh, they just took this other country 300 miles north up in Palestine. They took them and their kings. Well, it's a battle with Egypt, but they took it. You see, the point is that we don't know. There is no big rock somewhere in Palestine with a big inscription on it that says this was the spot that Israel was and Jerusalem was, and Solomon built his temple here. They have not found Solomon's temple. And as we said before, it's literally and physically impossible, because Palestine, I think people today in America, we look on the map and we think, oh, Palestine's way over there. It's a huge country. Superimpose Palestine over onto the United States. You'll see that Palestine is about the size of Massachusetts or New Hampshire or something. It's really small. Now imagine this little New Hampshire, this little bitty spot. Very, very, it's like one of the smallest states in the Union. And imagine this great city of Jerusalem, along with Bethlehem and Bethany and all these huge Tyre and Sidon and Beersheba and Bethel and all these major cities. And that's just Israel's cities, right? Millions. When they left Egypt, the Israelites numbered millions. So by the time of King David and Solomon, it was this vast empire where Solomon's building one of the 7 wonders of the world, basically, and bringing the Queen of Sheba, and she's bowing down to him and giving him gold and, like taxes, and like, oh, Solomon, you are the king of the world. And Solomon marries 1,000 wives, and they end up becoming the kings of all the world. But the rest of the world doesn't know anything about this, only in our Bible. And it ends up being the most important thing in history, that we need to know who all these kings were and who Solomon was, because we don't know who he was. But he darn sure wasn't down there in Egypt, right? So the Queen of Sheba, we don't even know where she came from. Who's that? We don't know who the Queen of Sheba is. Well, that's silly. We don't know who King David was, but we know he's there. And we're sure it's down there where Jerusalem is today. How do you know? They were taken captive into Babylon and then brought back to their land. We have no record where they were taken from other than they were taken. The only record we have is this big battle with Egypt. So they take this line of kings, and remember Daniel was of the tribe of Judah, and he ends up being taken into Babylon, and he becomes the royal prince. His three compatriots, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were also from the tribe of Judah, lineal descendants of the king, Zedekiah and Joachim. And they ended up being governors of satraps. What's that mean? It means that the entire empire of Babylon was the world, the known world, and they took this as a satrap and that's a satrap. In other words, they broke it up into governorships, or so. Say all in the area of Parthia would be one satrap, and they'd put a governor over that, and all the area of Syria would be another satrap, and they put a governor. Okay, so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego ended up being the governors of a large portion of the Babylonian empire. Because why? Oh, well, they were royal seed of David. They defeated Egypt and ended up with the royal seed of David. If you defeat Egypt, wouldn't you end up with the royal seed of Egypt? No, they ended up with the royal seed of King David. And Judah, the line of Judah, went into all the earth as captives, but not really just captives, they end up as kings. So Daniel becomes the ruler of Babylon, and then later on the ruler of Persia. I know, it's right there in the book of Daniel. And not only that, the head of the Magi. Well, that's important because that's where we get the word magistrate court. Because to this day, we're still under the Magi. No, I know. People have made you think that witches were bad and wizards were bad. They were the wise ones. Wizard means wise one. And a magician means a very powerful, political, religious priest. And the three wise men came and bowed before Jesus when he was born. There's so much more to the story than you have been told. And they don't have the archaeology to back up what they're saying. As we've said, we found Solomon's temple down in Egypt. And we're going to prove today, because this is what we need to do. We need to establish where in the heck was Jerusalem? Where were the children of Israel? What is this whole thing? We covered a little bit of it yesterday. But I want to really get down to the nuts and bolts of this. So, we can see there's something wrong. Well, all right, let's go back to, remember, we go back to Abraham goes into the land. He comes out of Ur of the Chaldees, which is over by Babylon. And God says, I'm going to show you a land. And the land that I will show you, I'm going to give it to you. And everything is now before he walks in, he says, now see, I'm up on this big mountain, and you look off and you see everything as far as you can see. I'm going to give all that land to you. And then he says, you're going to become a father of a multitude of nations. Not some nations, not one or two or three, but many, many multitudes of nations. Now, that stops short of saying all nations. But the Apostle Paul says he's the father of all, and he's the father of faith, meaning all the religions. We've talked about how Abram is his original name, and that's the same as the Indians' Brahmans, and it's not just a play on words, it's actual true. Abraham is the father of all religions. And because Israel was scattered into all the earth, and their prophets went into all the earth, and that's in the Bible, it tells you this. But Abraham got on the mountain, he looked around, and God told him in no uncertain terms, several times in many ways, that he would give him the land from the Nile to the Euphrates. See? Now wait a minute. I thought the land of Abraham and Jacob and Isaac was just that little old place over there in New Hampshire, right? That, like, as big as New Hampshire, like Palestine, which goes down to what the Negev, which on the map you see Negev, and it's just this little spot in southern Israel. Well, the word Negev means the southern region. And they're just putting that on a modern map. The southern region was down along the southernmost extreme end of the Nile. Yeah, as far south as you can go on the Nile, which is down in Lake Victoria in Africa. And because God doesn't lie, I mean, we can't just make this up as we go. We got to go by the scripture. And it says, Abraham, I'm going to give you all the land from the Nile all the way to the Euphrates. Well, where does the Euphrates River go? Well, it goes from the Gulf all the way north, way up into, across eastern Turkey, all the way up to the northern Turkey. So it includes almost all of Turkey. And it extends farther west than you probably ever was told. And if you look up on a map, you'll see, if you take a line from the River Nile and go north all the way up to Goshen, and it'll go right through the Mediterranean. It includes all of Cyprus and a bunch of islands in there, Crete, all of Turkey, all the way down to Iraq, Arabia, Yemen, Africa. And remember, it's not just to the one side of the Nile, both sides of the Nile. I mean, come on. There's temples on both sides of the Nile, and they were the same people. So, God is telling Abraham, I'm going to give you the land of the Nile, both sides of the river, all the way to the Euphrates, both sides of the river. That's all yours and your descendants, because I'm not going to just give you one little piece of land for one little family, but you're going to be a father of a multitude of nations. There's going to have to be a lot of land. So, Abraham, when he first goes down, this is in chapter 15, he tells him, I'm going to give you all this land. And then, as we go through 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, and 21, these chapters, and then we get into Jacob and Isaac. But in those chapters in Genesis, you have all of this Abraham meeting Abimelech. Oh, well, that's some guy down there, a Babylonian king down there with a turban, and he's got 4 camels and a couple of monkeys, And they just sat out there and they said, hey, buddy, you want to dig a well and we'll just share the well because it's getting thirsty down here. What? No, these were nations. Abraham had a world war with Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and the king of Babylon. And Abraham had 18 legions and regiments and fought to save Lot, his nephew. Well, I suppose that was one thing, but it wasn't just some guy. It was an entire nation. Lot way down there in the south. And so this was an entire war. And so Abimelech means, Abi means father. Melech means Molech. So that's Father Molech. I know. We were told Molech was bad. Well, Molech is the great priest that goes all the way back to Enoch, the high priest who built that pyramid. I know. Yeah, it goes Adam. The 7th in line from Adam is Enoch, right? And then there was Lamech, and then there's Noah. Lamech. Oh, so this is a man, the genealogy for before the flood. And the first person that gets through the flood is Noah and his 3 sons, and his son Shem became the great high priest back to Adam. And so where did Shem rule? Well, he's called Melech Zadok. So Melech Zadok, according to the book of Hebrews, was the high priesthood of God and the same priesthood that Jesus received. So Molech is a different priesthood. And we can trace that line of Melech. I mean, Abraham stood there and made a covenant with Abimelech, an everlasting covenant. Not just for one well, that's symbolic, for truth and to share the land. Because the land is the whole world, and there's upper and lower. And we're going to get so deep in this, we're going to understand what upper and lower means. Everything below, where Cairo is on the map. That's where the Great Pyramid in Giza is, about that area. Well, that everything below that was considered the lower part of Egypt. Well, actually, it was called the upper part, as we've gone through this before. It gets very confusing. So I just go by northern and southern, because the northern part was called the lower part because it was lower in elevation. The land of Goshen had all these rivers that spoiled it. That's the land where eventually Joseph's going to get in his blessing, because it's such spoiled by rivers. Oh yeah, and Joseph ends up being the seed that is taken into all the earth, a great mixed multitude coming up out of Egypt, that goes on the ships of Dan. Remember, it says in the prophecies that Dan shall be a serpent, by the way, and you'll be able to find him along the pathway, and all of these blessings shall be upon my sons. And here is their blessing upon the head of Joseph. He shall receive the dew of heaven, and his bow shall go over the wall, and his branch shall be prosperous and go over the wall and be by a fountain of water and grow. His vine, and Hosea says he shall become a multitude in the earth. So Israel's ultimately going to cover all nations and tribes and tongues. So it starts from a center place, and that center place is between northern and southern Egypt. And the great center would be then Jerusalem, because remember, we have a word today in English, Jerusalem, which comes from a Hebrew, Urusalim, which comes further, which is just the language that the Jews spoke after they got back out of captivity. But originally, Solomon didn't even speak Hebrew, my friend. And how do we know that? Because the Bible was originally written in Egyptian, because Solomon built the temple in Luxor and Thebes, Egypt. Well, how do you know that, Dave? Now, you're just saying a bunch of stuff that just makes no sense. Well, because we have absolute proof. We found the writings of Solomon, which were the laws of Solomon, alongside the Torah that they used down there. Because Solomon came after Moses, so they had the Torah. But Solomon wrote another bunch of wise sayings, and we've dug them up, and they're in Egypt, and Akhenaten wrote these, the Pharaoh of Egypt. He's the one who wrote it. That was Solomon, a Pharaoh. And it's written in Egyptian, and it's almost word for word, as the writings we have in Ecclesiastes and Proverbs and some of the apocryphal, all the writings, the Jews call them the writings. They were originally written in Egyptian, because that's the language they spoke. The southern kingdom of Judah is southern Egypt, all the way down in Africa. And then the northern part, where the 10 tribes were, is everything from the Great Pyramid north up into Goshen, all the way into Palestine, all the way to Iraq, all the way up to Turkey, Europe, all that. Later on, it's going to go into all the world. And so Jerusalem, Uru, is Oru, or Or. Now, the Bible tells you a lot of stuff that we just don't pay any attention to. King David conquered the city of the hill of Zion. We don't know where that is. It's not like we can go find a book somewhere that says, oh, Zion was over here. We don't know. It gives it different names. Sometimes it calls it Mount Moriah. So the city of David was on Mount Moriah. Well, Moriah is an Egyptian word. M-R, and Egyptians are just like Hebrews. They don't have vowels. So they just got the consonants. M-R. M-R stands for Mor, or Moriah, or Mora, or Meru. The great mountain in Africa, one of the tallest mountains in Africa, is Mount Meru. And in ancient times, remember, all this has got several layers of meanings. So when we're looking at the Bible, we're looking at a small history between the Nile and the Euphrates as one fulfillment. But the word Mer in Egyptian meant pyramid. That's how they said it. That's their word for pyramid. And the Great Mer is the Great Pyramid that all their other temples were patterned after, because the Great Pyramid was patterned after a great mountain, which in ancient time was the great mountain of the Lord, Mount Meru. So they began to call this great mountain that they built, the pyramid, they called it Mr, Mer, or adding the vowels, it's Moriah. I mean, today we say Moriah. I mean, we don't know if that's Moriah or Mura or Muru or whatever, but it's Mr. And that's, so David goes down, gets the Ark of the Covenant back from the Philistines. We don't know where they were, but I guarantee they were down there in Egypt. The 5 Axis kings of the Philistines. And he finally gets the Ark of the Covenant, which is the presence of God, and he makes a tabernacle for it in the city of David. Well, it didn't build a temple. The temple was already built. I mean, the Great Pyramid was already built. But he captured Mount Moriah. And if you go to the Bible, you'll find what this mountain was. When Moses went up on the mountain, calling it Horeb or Orb or the Mountain of Light. Remember, it's Ra, the Temple of Ra originally. We'll get into that a little bit more. But Moses says it has a great pavement work at the base. And in our Bible where it says Moses went up on the mountain, in actual Hebrew it says he went into the mountain. There's an actual door that goes into the Great Pyramid. And it's got a pavement work of basalt and limestone. And there was jewels like emerald that used to be on the capstone of that Great Pyramid. And it shone like an emerald crystal above his head. And God came down and it says the mountain was on fire. Well, it was lit up. And there's various things that's in that, that's in that account where we can show that is the Great Pyramid. And so David captures it because it was in the hands of the Jebusites. They called it the city of Jebus for a while because it was, remember originally Melchizedek ruled there in this ancient city of Jerusalem, in the city of Salem, because he was called, in the book of Hebrews, he's called King of Salem and King of Righteousness, because Zadok means righteousness. So Melchizedek means the Lord Melech of righteousness, but Melech Salim is another word for it, or the king or the Lord of peace. And Jesus came in the same line of kings. Boy, there's so much I want to go off and veer off into to explain why this, that, and your thing. But got to stick to where we're at here. Understanding what this place was. So King David conquers the city. Calls it the city of David at this point. But he conquers Mount Moriah. And he gets the Ark of the Covenant. And he needs to make a house for the Ark of the Covenant. So he makes a tabernacle. He's got blood on his hands, and God doesn't want him to build a temple for it. So his son Solomon's going to be able to do that later. But right now, he just conquers this mountain, or this area of the temple, takes it from the Jebusites. And it says the place that he builds an altar. So he didn't build a temple, but he did build an altar, probably like a megalithic, monolithic phallic symbol, like you see, like an obelisk, like we have in Washington, or like, they're found down in Luxor, Egypt, or in the Vatican, or in France, or in London. There's a big obelisk. These go back to this ancient kingdom. And he builds this obelisk as a monument. Well, where does he build it? The Bible says, in the field of Ornan, the threshing field of Ornan. Well, there's some places in the Bible it says Aran now, but in most of the time it'll call it Ornan. Ornan is or, light, and Nan is the Anu. So this is the father, Anu, which in the Greek is Oranu. So Ornan is the field of the kings. And through other places in the Bible, we can find out this was called Kiriath Arba as well. Kiriath is the place of the 5 kings. I think the 4 kings of Arba. Some people don't know whether that was a guy named Arba or whatever, but it's the place that the Bible calls Hebron, Arba, or Hebron, because it says in the Bible that Kiriath Arba was what it was called under the Jebusites. But when David took it, they renamed it Hebron, or Hebron. It's almost the same word. They didn't really rename it. They just said they took it. So Hebron is where the Hebrews came from. And it's also where we get the mountain of Horeb. In other words, it's not a different mountain. One's called Moriah, one's called Hebron, or Horeb. It's the mountain of Horeb, of Hebron, which is at other times called Mur, or the Great Pyramid. So, but all these words have to do with light, the sun, and the Greeks call it Heliopolis. Heliopolis is the way the Greeks say the sun. Helios is the sun, and opolis is city, or polis is the city. So, in Hebrew, they have the word El for the sun, or Elohim, or, and sometimes it's Olympus, or whatever, the mountain of El, Olympus. But all of these different words all refer to this center of the earth. Now, if you look in the Old Testament, you'll find that cave that spot was originally a place where there was a cave or an underground tunnel, which there is under the pyramid. And when Abraham came there, it belonged to Melchizedek, because remember, Melchizedek had it, and later on they call him Adoni-Zedek, or the Lord of Righteousness. They were the rulers there, until you get down to Abimelech, which is the guy who had no child, and they had a levirate marriage with Boaz and Ruth, which is welding another line into that king line going back to Molech, or Melchizedek, or this city of Ornan, or Oranos, or the mountain of Mor, or the pyramid, or this great mountain Horeb. And under the mountain, according to the Old Testament, there is this cave, and it's called Machpelah in Hebrew. All right, so what? That's called Machpelah. We don't know what that means. Let's move on. Why don't you look it up? Because if you look it up, it's a very mysterious word. It literally means an enfolding cave at the center of the world that enfolds within itself in the very center. So that cave is not just any old cave, but it's the center of the world. And actually, the Great Pyramid of Giza is at the exact geological center of all the continents of the world. The exact geological center. And there is a great pit and a cavern that goes down under the Great Pyramid. And it has many chasms, and it goes down, and it goes, for miles. There's caverns, they won't let you down there. It goes down south to this lake of Moriah, which, according to Herodotus, has a great labyrinth with all the ancient wisdom of Enoch and the ancient works of Adam and Noah that we only have fragments of, called our Bible, which is going to be revealed to mankind one day. It's hidden up until the time of the end. But that area down there, then, is Machpelah. It's called the Cave of Machpelah at Kiriath Arba, or today Hebron, or the Hebrews, or Mount Horeb, which means orb, the sun, or the light, or in Greek, they renamed it, Heliopolis. But the ancient Egyptians didn't call it Heliopolis. They called it Moriah. It was a copy of the big Muru, but it was their way of saying the Great Pyramid. That was the Mount Moriah. And so David built a tabernacle and set up an obelisk, but he didn't build the temple. Solomon builds a great temple, the Temple of Solomon. He describes every piece of it, but it wasn't on the spot where David was. It was some distance away from it. If you look on a map and you see where Solomon's temple is and then where David's city is, it's a little bit of there's a few miles apart. But in the real world, Solomon built the temple in Luxor, Egypt. So that's not Jerusalem. It's just an outskirt. It's quite a ways from the pyramid, actually. But all those pyramids down there were one by one, they built them in different periods of time. And that's what the Bible's talking about as the city of Jerusalem and the temple of Solomon. So then the Assyrians come in 722, and they take the northern tribes into captivity. What are the northern tribes? Well, okay. So Moses, let's go back. Moses goes in and he goes down into Egypt. Well, first Joseph went down in there. You know, that's the story before. And Joseph ends up becoming Pharaoh, right? Marries the daughter of On or Anu. And that's that area, that's the town that the Greeks called Heliopolis. And it's the seat of the kings back to Molech, Father Molech. So you can say King On, or, you know, Anu, the god in heaven, or you can say his representative on earth, Molech, right, back through Noah to Lamech, back to Adam, or you can say it different ways. And he goes, they didn't always say Molech. Sometimes they said Adonai-Zedek, because Adon was another Egyptian god. And so sometimes they call God Adonai, sometimes they call him Molech, something, you know, different names. Amun, Ram, Ra, Moses, Ramses, you know, different words. And so you'd have God's name and then the name of one of the prophets, like Ammon Hoseph, that's Joseph. Amun is one of the gods. Okay, so all of the Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you can find them in the pharaohs. Jacob was a pharaoh. Amarbrim was the pharaoh before Jacob. Interesting, huh? And so you can follow this all the way down to Ammon Hoseph, who's Joseph. And it's that very king that writes all of these ecclesiastical psalms and poems and things that we have in our Bible. But it's written in Egyptian, because that's where they lived. Well, so then it goes down to 400 years they sojourn down there, and one of the southern pharaohs, in other words, of the tribe of Molech, or of the lineal descendants of Melchizedek down to Adonai-Zedek, all the way down to this guy named Ornan, which I don't think that was a guy named Ornan. I think the Bible's trying to say this is the city of the lineal descendants of the Oranu, or the great king of Anu, or of the city of On in Heliopolis. That's the same spot. So this is the spot then where Solomon, well, we were talking about Moses first. So Moses goes down in there, and they were going to kill all the babies and stuff like that. And so they took Moses and put him in a little wicker basket, and they put some bitumen on it so it would seal it like a little boat, and put this little baby in it and put him down the river. And of course, the daughter of Pharaoh finds him, and she loves him, and she raises him as her own. Well, that's a little story, but it really means that they raised him. There's some other evidence that shows, in apocryphal writings, that shows that they knew who the baby was. It was a royal seed, and it didn't, and so it was destined to that this royal birth of Joseph would become the Pharaoh of Egypt. Yes, that he would marry the daughter of On, or the lineal descendants of the Melchizedek priesthood down there in Egypt. So Joseph did marry the daughter of On and became the high priest and the Pharaoh, anointed by his Egyptian wife, Mary, because they always called them Marys. And I don't want to get in often on any other tangents here. But so Moses then led the people of Israel out of Egypt. Well, it says that he led them for 40 years. As we've said before, 360 degrees in a circle. Why do we say 360 degrees? Because it's a wheel. He's going to lead them in a procession around and around. There's 12 tribes They each take each of the 12 houses of the Zodiac is one of the 12 tribes, and they are going to go in a procession around, coming out from the center. So that's why it takes 40 years, because they're just scoping everything out, and they're just wandering. Why are they wandering? Why does it take 40 years to get from Egypt all the way up to Palestine? Well, they weren't going to Palestine. They spent 40 years going all the way around, scoping out and spying out the land all the way from Iraq, all the way down into Africa, all the way around. And then when Moses dies, when he's 120 years old, Joshua crosses the river. And it takes them another 40 years just to even say that they had supposedly the conquest of the land. Well, it's not one little land. Each of the tribes gets a different place, and they go from place to place having these battles. We don't know where all these battles were. Well, I'm telling you, each of these battles were in different locations, from Africa all the way up into Turkey and Babylon and Iraq and, Europe. That's why it took 40 years just to get to they didn't completely conquer the land in 40 years. They just started it. It took hundreds of years. Even by the time of David, they hadn't fully gotten rid of the Philistines or the Canaanites or whatever. They're still conquering land. It took a long time, because it's this huge, vast area from the Euphrates River. As far as the eye can see, I'll give you this land. Wherever your foot treads, I shall give you that land. Well, their foot treaded a lot of places when Moses went around for 40 years in this circle. 40 times 360 is 144,000, because ultimately we're talking about the great temple of the world and the 12 gates of the temple and the 144,000 stones that build it up. So now we've got Israel scattered all over between the Euphrates and the Nile. And they go down into the year 720, and Assyria comes along, and they take the northern tribes. Well, they couldn't take, you can't imagine that Assyria took everybody from Goshen all the way up to Turkey and Iraq and took them to Assyria. No, according to history, he only took mostly from the two tribes, from Manasseh and Ephraim. Because remember, Ephraim's the one's going to be like seed. That was the one that's got the lineal descendants of Abimelech, Joseph's seed. And Joseph had a vision, remember, when he was born, that all the 12 tribes shall bow down to him. But yet Judah was told, the scepter will not depart from Judah until he who comes who has the legal right. Well, how they dealt with that is this. There was a place called Bethlehem, which is a city that was at the border near Jerusalem, which was also at the border between upper and lower Israel. So where Cairo is, or where the Great Pyramid is, that's the border, and in the midst thereof, which the Bible says is the Great Pyramid, at the border in the midst thereof in Egypt. So that's the line between northern and southern Egypt. And that would also be the line between northern and southern Israel. Well, and that's where Jerusalem was. So right there around Goshen was where Ephraim was. Because if you look at a map that shows you Israel, how they conquered the land, the first layout of how they originally conquered it, imagine that little strip that we call Israel now, but expand it to what it's actually supposed to be, from the Euphrates to the Nile. So therefore, the two tribes of Judah and Benjamin would be down below the Great Pyramid. And the 10 tribes would be Goshen and everything, the northern Egypt, and everything up through Palestine, over to Iraq, and up into Turkey and Cyprus and all of that area. So the 10 tribes would have this vast area. But they didn't come in, the Assyrians didn't come in and take all of those people. They just came into Goshen and probably up into Palestine and took Manasseh and Ephraim. So then, 150 years later, in the year, around year 600, they came in and took the tribe of Judah. But this time it's the Babylonians, because now Assyria is no longer the world power, because they had a battle at Carchemish with Egypt, and they failed because Babylon fought a confederacy of Assyrians and Egyptians, which is actually the Israelites, and they lost. So then Babylon becomes the world power, and in 600 they come down and take the Jews. And as we said, it doesn't say anywhere in the history of the world that the Jews lived in Palestine. They took the Jews, but they had a battle with Egypt, not with the Jews. So they took the royal seed of Egypt into Babylon that we call Jews, the tribe of Judah. And for some time, they remained in Babylon. In fact, up until recently, the city of Baghdad was almost 90% Jewish. The Talmud was written there. I mean, they was all full of Jewish people for ever since then. But some of the people from Babylon did go back because of the call to go forth to restore and to rebuild Jerusalem. Well, when they went back to the land of Israel, which covers the entire area from the Nile to the Euphrates. And by the time of Herod the Great, they started rebuilding a temple, not knowing where the original temple was, because that wasn't important anymore. But they began to build a temple in Palestine called Herod's Temple. And that's where we pick up the story. So there's a lot of confusion, and we're going to have to do, probably in some coming videos, we're going to have to find some more, we're going to explain it with a lot more evidence until we finally understand this is the real truth. Because it's important that we fully grasp that Israel is all mankind. The Jews is only 2 tribes. And that these men and all these tribes were to be in all the world. The 4 winds of heaven. They were between the Euphrates and the Nile, but when they migrated, they went outward. As you expand and you have more children and babies, you go outward from the core, from the center, like spokes in a wheel. And remember how in a astrological wheel, remember how we said that we always go forward. So we're going to be going into the age of Taurus. So you start off, and Aries is over. Imagine Aries over on your left at the beginning of the wheel. The next house is Taurus. Jesus was the lamb, or that ram, Aries. And we've been living for 2,000 years in the house of Aries. So at the end of this age, the end of 2,000 years, we'll be going into the house of Taurus. Now, a lot of people have said, well, no, that's not true because of the precession of the equinoxes. We're actually going backwards. It's retrograding. And so we're now going to be going, we started off at the beginning of Aries. Instead of going through Aries, we got out of Aries right away because we were going the other way. And we was going through Pisces all this time. And now we're about to go into the age of Aquarius. Here's why that's not true. You'll see, if you'll look on the internet and you'll look up a zodiac wheel, you'll see a lot of them are backwards. Instead of having Aries and then Taurus going clockwise, it'll be the opposite. Taurus is going backwards. Now, why is that, Dave? Well, there is a precession of the equinoxes due to the wobble of the earth. But you see, that has nothing to do with our progression towards Taurus. Here's why. Imagine looking at a clock. As you know, the clock always goes forward. Never does time goes backward. Never does the calendar ever go backward. We go from January to February to March. You see, we don't go backward. Ever, ever, ever. And so, the heavens revolves around and around and around. And never goes backwards. So why are some of these astrological charts backwards? What is this? Well, because if you're looking at a clock, the hands of the clock go clockwise. But we're stationary. When you're looking at the heavens, you see the stars going around. We appear to be stationary. Well, with a clock, it's the hands of the clock going around. But what if the hand of the clock never moved? Well, then the entire clock would have to move backwards in a retrograde. But the hands of the clock would still be going forward. So in other words, we don't have, it's much simpler. Instead of just turning the clock backward, it's much simpler to turn the hands of the clock forward. But either way, from our perspective, time's still going forward either way. Whether you move the clock backward, whether you take the heavens and put the astrological signs and you retrograde them backwards, or whether or not you imagine us moving through forwards, either way, we're going forwards. If the heavens are going backwards, we're still going forwards. It's like one of those Rubik's Cube mind teasers. It's hard for people to understand. Why would, if the astrological wheel is retrograding, then we're going backwards? No, we don't go backwards. The heavens appear to be going backwards because we're going forwards. From our point of view, we've gone forwards, and now we're going into Taurus. Well, if we're going to go into Taurus, then the heavens have had to have retrograded because we're going forward. That's all that's happening here. There's no retrograde in time. So sometimes they make astrological zodiac wheels backwards to show the retrograde of the heavens. So you can find out, oh, now instead of Aries coming up in spring, now it's Pisces. Oh, we must be going backwards. No, we're going forwards. Thank goodness we can see that because of the fact that the heavens is retrograding. So now, instead of being in Aries, we're up in Taurus. So, now remember, this astrological chart not only is a way to understand time and 3 different kinds of time. You got the hours, you got the months, and you've got the astrological ages. They all work the same way. We all go forward. But at the same time, remember as we said in Daniel gives various layers. He says the Leo, the lion, is the first government. Well, he's talking about when we were in the age of Leo, when Leo reigned. And then we go down through the bottom of the wheel. We go to the Virgo, who gives birth. We go down through Scorpio. We go to Sagittarius, the horses with faces of men coming up out of the bottomless pit. That's in Revelation. We've got the beast going down through the 3 days and 3 nights at the bottom of the wheel, the Jonah's whale, or Aquarius and Pisces. And then we get to the ram, or Aries. And then Daniel sees, I see a ram with 2 horns. Okay, so he's looking at astrology, and you can understand it in one sense as we're ruled over by the astrological animals in the sky. The Zodiac means a wheel of animals in Greek. So, on the other hand, he says the lion also represents a type and a shadow of the reality. The type is that Leo represents Babylon, would be the first kingdom on earth, and then it would go down through Persia, Greece, and then Rome. And as we've talked about the Holy Roman Empire and on down, he talks about this beast got 7 heads and each would come up in succession. So in another sense, what it's saying is that the lion of the tribe of Judah is the tribe of the lion or the Leo. And Jesus is going to be not only the lion, but he's also going to be the unicorn, or Joseph, or Taurus. Now, if you look in the emblems on the shields and things up there in England, you'll see that Britain's got this unicorn, and they've got lions too, because they have the royal blood of the tribe of Judah, and they've got the royal blood of the tribe of Melchizedek as well, all the way back through the Molech line, because the Egyptian priesthood, or the line of kings that sits on the throne of Britain, they, in their history, tell you of this Tia Tifi, which was a princess from Egypt. We don't have time to get into that. We'll get into it at some point during this series. But these royal bloodlines have to have a royal princess from the line of Melchizedek. Always have to have it. And then a male descendant of Judah to become king. So this is why we talked about Ptolemy. Ptolemy ended up, he wouldn't become king unless he could wed this native royal bloodline from the races of Africa down there, the original line from the Molech or the Canaanite line that originally ruled that area. Remember, Abraham made a covenant with them that they would rule together and share the wealth. We haven't got time to get into that yet either. But so if Babylon then is Judah, then get an astrological chart and put the Leo at the bottom of the wheel towards Babylon. Well, the rest of the animals fall into place as to where all the tribes will be. We'll get into that in another video. But in the smaller, when they go in and they conquer the land originally, it's not going to be where they're ending up in prophecy. Ultimately, prophetically, in the book of Exodus and Deuteronomy, it gives where they will eventually end up, where each of the tribes will eventually end up. But in the conquest of the land with Moses, they were just conquering the land from the Nile to the Euphrates. And Judah got the southern part. Joseph got Goshen. And so this little town of Bethlehem, which is not far from Jerusalem, was on the border between Ephraim, which is the firstborn son of Joseph, and Judah. And so therefore in the Bible it's sometimes called Ephraim, it's sometimes called Bethlehem of Ephraim, and sometimes Bethlehem of Judah, because it's on the border. And it had both of the lines, and all the king lines came from there, because David was from Bethlehem, as Jesus was, born there. Because the royal bloodlines, to become king, you must, by necessity, have a royal princess from the southern kingdom and a northern, remember Abraham came down from the north, and a northern male line to form the royal bloodline. Therefore, Judah did the Levirate marriage when Elimelech had no seed. Molech was Elimelech, and he had no seed. And so Naomi took her daughter-in-law Ruth, and they had a Levirate marriage with Boaz, who was of Judah. And they welded the line because there was no more lineal descendants to carry on. Because what happens is that they would marry their sister for some generations, but then you couldn't do that indefinitely. You had to find one of the royal princesses to renew the line. So when you got down to Elimelech, the great priesthood of Molech or Melchizedek could no longer sustain that lineage. They had to take from Boaz and Ruth and form a sort of a welding of the two lines, because Abraham came down into Egypt and welded the northern line with the southern line. And that's basically always how it's done. The same thing is going up in Europe with the Tia Tifi going into the line of Britain. Same thing is done down in South Africa. Wherever you go, the royal bloodlines of all the world have to be from Joseph and from Judah. And so Jesus then was son of David, the Ephraimite. And Ephraim, remember, was the son of Joseph, who was the son of the daughter of On, who was Shechem's daughter, according to the Bible. Shechem was a Canaanite from the Amalekites, or Amalekites is Molech. And the Amalekites were the ones who ruled Shechem. And the daughter of Shechem was the son of Abimelech, or father Molech. And they ruled down there at the Great Pyramid. And Abraham came down there and made a covenant with Abimelech, father Molech. remember when they went down there originally, Abimelech said, that's a beautiful woman. Is that your daughter? What, I want to marry her. And Abraham, now in our Bible, it's kind of strange. It says something about Abraham's, oh, she is my sister. Also, we think, oh, he was just trying to lie. Abraham didn't lie. Abraham is saying, my sister, meaning I'm a royal king, and that's my sister princess. Well, Abimelech says, well, I'm royal too. Let's make a deal. Let's weld our two kingdoms together, the northern and the southern, which is very symbolic of the spiritual and the physical of the great wedding that's coming. But suffice it to say, the wedding didn't take place exactly as they had planned, because God had other plans. But Abraham married his sister, as Jesus married his sister Selena, Mary Magdalena, of the Triple Tower in Alexandria of Egypt. Because when Heliopolis was leveled to the ground, they took all the libraries and all that information, and Alexander and the Ptolemies rebuilt a temple up in Alexandria and built the great lighthouse, which is the great temple and the great library where Pliny and Plutarch and Josephus and all the great, philosophers and priests and great ones studied and brought about civilization and democracy and world progression. All coming from the great line of the pharaohs from that land. So that gives you a basic gist of what we're talking about. It's going to take a few snippets of history and some more explanation to get this all down in our mind so that everybody is able to perceive that what we're talking about is true and we're not just making all this up. There's so much we got to go through. The ancient Lemurians before Atlantis, Lemura, that's the ancient kingdom of Meru, which is the great mountain in Africa. Meru, which is what today has come down to us as the Moriah, the Mount Moriah. That's why in Japan they have a Mount Moriah, because as they're remembering back, we all came from Mount Moriah, from our beginning, from the center. And like this, on the spokes of the wheel, we're all going out, one of the tribes. And we have our final destination to conquer the land of the world, not just that one little spot there in New Hampshire, or what appears to be the size of New Hampshire called Palestine. That is just something that happened when they came back to their land. Only 2 tribes came back, and it was not the original location for Jerusalem. So we'll get back into that and explain more about that, because there's so much more we got to explain. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and go. Hope you guys have a really great day. This is David Vos. Oh, just before I go, I noticed that there's a big old, what is that, a crane, or what do you call those things? I forget, right? Heron or something? Isn't that beautiful? Aw, isn't that nice? I didn't even see the old guy till just now. I was too busy talking. Oh! I thought maybe he'd pull up a fish there a second. Huh. This is such a beautiful, beautiful creature. Just so elegant. Full of grace. Looks like he's fishing. He might pull a fish up out of there in a second. Well, I'm glad we got to see that. All right, guys. We'll see you again tomorrow. Have a good one.